one then, we've obviously determined that there is more than the 3 styles of white oak that we use. Has any other white oak been tried then, or sort of going back to like the red oak? But obviously, have we tried extensively other white oaks, or?
I mean, I think maybe back in the day you'd have used chestnut, which was a lot more porous as well, a lot more tannic. Acacia was another one back in the day, but now I think people tend to stick to the norm, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of strikes me again, going back to the Macallan then, so we're looking at those rich sherry notes, and I think most people kind of do feel that Macallan is all about the sherry, but obviously more recently you have brought the bourbon casks in. Now, would there, sort of a two-part question, would you ever consider making the sherry casks and seasoning them at the bourbon barrel size, or would that just not be practical money-wise and cost-wise? And how much more bourbon cask are you starting to use now?
Well, so bourbon was really kind of brought in for part of our fine oak range. So it was, the 3 wood types, maybe more influenced by, bourbon and American rather than the European. And no, we've never went down the route of seasoning a bourbon barrel with sherry. We've tended to stick to the butts, the puncheons, and the hogsheads, and that was simply because, going back to the sawmills, the orders that we're placing with them based on warehouse vacuity that we have was then maximising that timber. So we'll have some suppliers who solely produce American oak for us. We'll have other suppliers who supply just European, and others that's a mix between European and American, and different cask sizes as well.
Yeah, and so with that then, you're obviously just saying there that kind of bourbon was brought in for the fine oaks sort of side of it. Could we ever see a pure bourbon Macallan?
Highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely, yeah.
Highly unlikely. Yeah. Our numbers, in terms of the amount of bourbon barrels that we're actually filling now is less.
Yeah. Right. So it's So does that tell us that the fine oak might be getting phased out then, or?
I think there could be plans maybe in the future that you would maybe see a swing to or moving out of fine oak. I think this is where the double cask range has now kind of superseded that. To be honest, with the new introduction of 15 and 18, and I think it's offering the consumer something else. I mean, bourbon barrels were predominantly brought into the Scotch whisky industry for grain fillings, and now you're seeing an interesting swing towards single malts. People are wanting to try different styles and different characters, and I think it's fantastic. It's go out there and try different brands and different products. But bourbon barrel had a purpose for obviously the American bourbon barrel industry, and then because they were readily available for the Scotch whisky industry, that was what was predominantly filled into.
And one question that came to me before we started, somebody asked me, and I'll get it in while I'm thinking about it. So Macallan's obviously, as far as I'm aware at the moment, 100% unpeated. Do you ever see the Macallan using a peated whiskey, or would you ever consider having some peated liquid put into some cask so you can do a sort of peated cask or anything?
Well, we have. I mean, we had M Black, which was a kind of a peated element that was in there. There was a smokiness. So there has been some products that they've put out there that have a slight peatiness to them. It's not something that the brand is synonymous with. But bearing in mind that Edrington bought Macallan in 1999 from Suntory and from Highland Distillers, who we had the share in. And prior to that, it was a private company. So, you know, there would be stock that's been laid down as a private company that could be different. It'll be different cask types, and it could be, you know, different styles of liquid.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because obviously, I mean, I wasn't aware because I've not tried the M neither. So that there was some peated. So was that peated whiskey or was it a peated cask? I presume it was peated whiskey rather than put into a cask that had previously held.
Yeah, there could have been a bit of both there, Soren, to be quite honest with you. Yeah, because you know, back in the days, you would be firing your stills with peat.
Well, that's kind of where I was about to go with. So some of these older Macallans that are coming out, would they have a peated element to them? Sort of, you know, the 50, 60, 70-year-olds are.
They potentially could, or they might have in previous years. They might have filled casks that previously had held peated whiskey. You know, people tended to buy what casks were available in the market. So, you know, that's why, although that style now from Macallan is very much driven by sherry, you know, in the past, it would have been what was available to buy cask-wise in the open market.
Yeah. And with that, obviously, looking at the way Macallan put their whiskies together, I think I'm right in saying you've got quite a new team of whiskey makers and things like that, because I believe you just added Kirsten a few years back. And so how's the sort of chemistry working between the team? Is it you've got two people choosing how the whiskies are going to be made and it's a team effort, or is it actually a full team effort?
It's a full team effort. I mean, that was just last year that they created the team. I mean, Kirsten has worked for Edrington, I think, since 2007. So, you know, 13 years initially on Cutty Sark and Grouse, and then latterly on a bit on Glenrothes as well. And then you had Sarah Burgess, you had Polly Logan, Russell Gregg, and Stephen Bremner, who were part of that whiskey making team. So, you know, Kirstine coming in to lead it, along with myself, then as part of that, you know, expertise and knowledge and production and casks. It gels well because, you know, basically, if they're looking for any particular styles or flavours later on in that maturing spirit, then it's obviously important that we get that set out at the onset. So, you know, when we're placing orders with suppliers, we're then maybe altering these specifications depending on that style and character that they could be potentially looking for in later bottlings.
Yeah. And obviously we're bringing the new distillery online as well. Have you noticed anything different between the new spirit coming out and how it's interacting with wood compared to the old distillery?
No, I mean, it's still early days, but everything looks to be the same. I mean, that was probably one of the most critical points, that spirit didn't change in its style and its character. And, you know, I mean, it's only 2018 since the new distillery, so it's still relative terms, but any spirit samples that we've seen would be similar to what we've had in the past.
And with that, then obviously I mean, the obvious answer is going to be yes to this, but so you've obviously increased capacity. You're having to obviously buy a lot more casks to cater for that capacity. Now, with the way things are at the moment, the climate, has that proved difficult, or was this already pre-planned 5-6 years ago anyway?
I think one of the early conversations that I was involved in prior to the distillery being built was, if we're building a new distillery and we're going to increase our production, have we got sufficient enough wood? And this is where a lot of these surveys came in, just to reassure us that we had sufficient enough timber to meet that increasing demand. So yes, that journey really from the felling of the trees to the delivery of the cask to the distillery, or at any of our distilleries, would be between 5 and 6 years.
Yeah, yeah. And with that then, so the fact that you're kind of pre-buying the wood ready for making your own cask, has that got any influence on the price a cask cost you then? Because, I mean, a lot of us know that for a good sherry cask, it isn't cheap compared to a bourbon cask, but if you're pre-buying the wood and seasoning it yourself and all, does this bring the prices down at all?
I certainly like to think that we were maybe getting a wee bit of a bargain, given the volumes and the time scales. I mean, we're placing orders 3 years in advance, so that allows that whole chain just to understand what volumes is required in future years, and it's a rolling 3-year contract we have with them. So it allows them to invest in their infrastructure. It allows us to be guaranteed that we have the volumes of wood that we need as well.
Yeah, and with the increase then, and obviously you're having to increase the amount of cask that you're seasoning, are you having to try and source out new bodegas all the time then? Or are the 3 that you use quite capable of supplying you with what you need?
No, they're capable. I mean, we're using Gonzalez Bias, Williams and Humbert, one of our private, or one of our cooperages that have their own bodegas attached to them as well. So for the capacities that we need, these 4 or 5 bodegas actually have sufficient enough volume for us, in capacity.
Yeah, and jumping way back, because I meant to ask this earlier and I forgot. One of the questions I did get sort of come up into my head was, obviously you get the wood, it's chopped, it's put into not exactly staves, but into slats and things like that. You then bring it, I think you bring it from the north down to the south to dry. Would there be any difference in kiln drying it compared to air drying?
Yes. So everything that we prepare wood-wise is air dried. Okay, nothing is kiln dried at all. I mean, you're looking for these tannings and impurities to be naturally reduced from the timber. So you maybe will leave it in the north of Spain to reduce part of that moisture content, simply because if you then start moving, say, from the north to the south of Spain, or from the east coast of America to the south of Spain, it's dead weight. You've got more moisture in your wood there, so you're trying to reduce part of that moisture to initially get it down to maybe 35–40%, and then that latter stage of between 12 and 18 months in the south of Spain would be taking it down to between 12 and 16 degrees moisture. And at that point, then you start to manufacture it into a stave, and then subsequently into a cask.
Yeah, so you are bringing it down to, like you say, about 12–16% moisture. Is that quite a critical point, or could you bring it down lower, or could you work with it slightly higher? Or does that affect the way the tannins and things like that work later on?
I wouldn't want to bring it any lower for what we need it for. You might be able to do it a little bit higher. I certainly wouldn't maybe want to go anything above 18 degrees. Or 18%, sorry, moisture. So, even between 12 and 16, it's fine. You've got a sufficient enough window to allow you to manufacture from there. Yeah.
So what I'm going to do now is, because I'm conscious, obviously, that we've kind of said an hour to start with, so I'm gonna bring it into the group now. I know Ed's got a question, so we'll start off with Ed if we can.
Hi, Stuart.
Hi there.
You've talked about, well, we sort of just talked about European oak when talking about sherry casks. Is that a? Would you say that that's a conscious decision just to use European oak when making sherry casks, given that American oak is very common in the sherry industry? And if so, is that kind of unique to you guys, or would you say that most people that are getting casks built to be seasoned with sherry will be choosing European oak over American oak?
Well, we do both. We split between American oak, which is then seasoned with sherry, and we also have European oak that's seasoned with sherry. So that's the two different styles that we prefer to use. As I said earlier, that seasoning wine that we are using isn't going into a bottle of sherry that you're then going to drink.
Yeah, of course.
You will. I have seen larger increases of sherry casks, new sherry casks being manufactured and bought for the whisky industry. And I would say that there would be a higher percentage of European oak to American oak.
Yeah. Okay.
Any more, Ed? Or
no, that's fine. Thank you.
right, I think Gary's got a question. He can ask that himself.
Hi, Stuart.
Hi there.
I was just wondering, you mentioned earlier on when you were talking about the bodegas, you mentioned how one was a cooperage with a bodega attached. Now, I might be reading too much into that, but does that mean that bodega exists just to season those casks that the cooperage is made, or let's say, is that just the way you said it?
No. I mean, some of the cooperages that we use will bottle their products, so they'll have wines that they will bottle for themselves, whether that's even distilling for brandy, some of that wine, or they've then got a contract with us, so that their wines are actually split up in terms of, yes, they're using seasoning wines, and then they're maturing casks that are their own, that then might be bottled in some products. So there's nothing untoward. I think it's just slightly different, that maybe like a lot of distilling companies in Scotland in the past used to have cooperages attached to them. Now there's very few cooperages that's attached to distilleries. They're relying on maybe third-party cooperages to repair and source their casks.
Yeah, I suppose that's kind of where I was coming at it from, where the cooperages would be attached to the distillery, but where the distillery essentially would come first, if you like, and then the cooperage was there to service the distillery. But in that sense, is the bodega there more to service the cooperage?
No, the bodega would be there. Well, I think from the private owners, that bodega would be there to service the cooperage and its customers, because their wines that they're maybe then selling on would be a smaller proportion of their business than, say, a bodega like Fundador or Gonzalez Baez or Williams and Humbert. Some of these big traditional sherry companies, theirs is very much driven by product going out the door, but part of that business is supplemented then by the whisky industry letting them, or using wines that's storing casks.
Super, cheers.
I mean, I'll probably get the pronunciation wrong on this, because I generally do, but do you have an opinion on Paxaret then?
I saw that question coming up there, so do I? Yeah, well, why add something else? That's just another additive that's used to enhance a liquid. And if you're buying an older cask, and you wanted to add a sweetener into it, why is that? Because the cask wasn't good enough in the first place. To be honest with you, I think now what people are maybe looking at is using sweeter wines to then try and influence that maturing spirit. So whether it was Sauterne, whether it was PX, Muscatel, something with a higher sugar content that's potentially in a previous use that's going to influence that new make spirit.
Yeah, and before I move on to Alistair, because I'm pretty sure he'll have quite a few questions for you.
I'll carry on, Soren, if you want. It's okay.
Well, what we'll do is then I'll actually make